Hello, hello, hello. My name is Robert. I am the recovery guy, and you have entered into The Fix. Hey, welcome back. My name is Robert. I am the recovery guy, and I am so excited to not only be in Daytona Beach, Florida, where the surf meets the turf and the sun and fun and all that happy stuff, but I'm with my dear friend Suzy, and I'll let her introduce herself. But Suzy is a friend of mine from Al-Anon, and I believe that within every alcoholic, there's an ACA or an Al-Anon who has Al-Anon status yet, and I admit that I'm sicker than others, and not only did I have to recover from alcoholism, I had to recover from people, places, and things, and that's what Al-Anon helps me do. So Suzy, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Robert. It is an absolute joy to be with you and Laura again. I look forward to these meetings. You know, we're the example of Instagram friends turned real life friends for 8+ years now, if you can believe that. Yeah. And because of your journey and your story of recovery, my family and my story look wildly different, because I said there's something there that means we can live free from this disease as well. And I absolutely love our reconnection moments, and of course we keep in touch all during the year.
Yes.
And we talk about all things recovery whenever we get a chance. So it's a joy to be here and talk about the kind of connection between both people getting better in the relationship. Yeah. As we previously discussed,
we believe that both people need to be going in the same direction at the same time, each responsible for their own wellness, to encourage each other. And that's what Al-Anon does. It helps free them from their addiction of codependency, but it helps give permission to the alcoholic to get well, because they're getting well at the same time. And there's nothing better than going in the same direction at the same time. To see another person get well, to see another person grow from that state of needing that person, just like I needed alcohol. You need people, don't you?
Yeah.
To make your feel good.
Yeah.
The same reasons I drank are the same reasons that you stuck around.
Yes. It's so funny, because we were just saying before when we were having lunch, if for us not to admit that we were as sick as the addict, who stays in those kinds of relationships where those things are happening? A very unwell person who is, whether it's over a period of time or because it's what you experienced growing up, that you would stay in a relationship that was so unhealthy. And if I'm not getting better, then there's no environment that alcoholic who's newly sober or trying to stay sober is going to enter that's going to be safe for them, because exactly what created the problem is where we are. And so nothing changes. So if I stay as sick and you start finding recovery, there's going to be an impasse that's met. And it's either going to be that your relationship with me matters more than your recovery and you relapse, or that you recognize your wellness is so important that now this relationship the Al-Anon thinks is so important that I'm willing to shred every bit of sanity just to hang on to. And so if you're both wanting to stay together, the only answer is to both get better.
At the same time.
Yeah,
I think it's really interesting. As much as I needed alcohol to medicate and to tell me that no matter what's going on, everything is okay, I needed you to stay sick. I needed you to say everything I was doing was okay, because I almost needed permission to stay in the home, to stay in the relationship, to stay in that. I needed you codependent.
Yes.
To co-sign my BS, to co-sign my shenanigans, to co-sign me getting as drunk, as inappropriate, or high, as inappropriate as that was, draining the bank account, losing the kids, losing everything we're willing to lose. Yeah. I needed you to stay sick. So sometimes in the rooms, tell me about why Al-Anon is so important, why you need to get well. Obviously, it goes better when I'm getting well, but why do you need to get well in spite of me recovering? Why?
Well, for the same reason you just said. If I don't get better, I need the addict to be sick, because then I don't have to look at the insanity that I've allowed. I don't have to look at myself and go, look back over the last 20 years and go, if you would have told me that I'd be in a situation where my children's parent is driving them around under the influence and somehow justify that that's okay, that is sick. That is not okay. That is not looking out for the well-being of anyone that I love. And so I am the only person that can change myself. I am. And as much as I tried to change my addict over the course of a quarter century, I found that to be completely ineffective, Robert.
Yeah.
Imagine that. So the answer wasn't in trying to change him or his choices. The answer, if I look at my life and say it has become unmanageable, and I admit the insanity of what I'm living in, the only choice I have is to look at myself, to take those warm blankets of denial off, those blinders, and say, what is going on in here? What is going on with me? And to be at the point where I was, sick and tired of being sick and tired, and to stop over functioning, that there's this weird thing that you draw on where you're over functioning in every way for the person that's not even showing up for their own life. Like, the moment I care more about your well-being than you do, there's a problem in the relationship.
Yeah.
There's an inequity there that means, why am I going to care more than you do about our well-being, your well-being? That's when it turns into what you call a hostage relationship. Mm-hmm. And it is critical that I recognize the only person I can change is myself. And so if I want them to get sober, the only way is to create a new environment where the previous behavior isn't acceptable. And I can only change me. And so even if my relationship doesn't survive this choice of wellness, I have to be brave enough to look at this and say, not just for myself, but for my children, there is another way. And I believe God can restore me to my sanity.
You bring up something very interesting where you said, as long as I'm caring more about you, isn't that part of the Al-Anon philosophy, to release that AH, that alcoholic husband or what have you, that addicted person that's dominating your life? As long as you care more about my wellness, aren't you denying your wellness?
Yes. We all have the same finite amount of hours, energy, all these things. And if I'm spending more of my energy looking at what you should be doing, and
and how if I get well, you'll be well by osmosis,
or blaming, like this person you had an interaction with very recently, that it's your problem that he's relapsing. Now that's for anybody that doesn't deal with this disease, that probably sounds completely insane. Well, to healthy people in this program, it is also insane. Yeah. In other words, you can't care more about his well-being than he cares about it, and you are not the reason. I'm not the reason anybody's going to drink or not drink. They're going to do and be exactly who they're going to do and be. And I get to decide what behavior is acceptable for me, for my well-being. And part of that includes me caring more about what's the next right thing for me to do for my wellness. Is it getting into it? Is it talking to my sponsor? Is it doing, some of the reading? Is it connecting in the ways to either, nature and in our cases, our profound faith? Those kind of things are things I can spend my energy on, not tracking someone's phone or looking through the cupboards for where they hid their stash.
I knew you were tracking us.
Yeah, it's like, that's insanity. I look at my life now and how full it is and the things that I have going on, and if I had to add into that worrying about somebody else doing what they said they were going to do and where they were going to be and how they were going to show up and what eggshells I had to walk on, to think of going back to that life now is just absolutely, it's impossible. Just like you're not going to drink again.
Yes.
I haven't had the same number of 14,000 and counting, days that you have, which is so impressive. It's what drew me to learn more about you, and then, because of that, learn about you and Laura's story and all of that layers. But, there is, you are a living, breathing example that you can make the right choice that many days strung in a row. And like you said to me at lunch, you don't not drink to not drink. You don't drink because of the joy you have in your life because of not drinking. Well, the same is for me. I don't go back and medicate with relationship or managing someone else or over-functioning, making excuses, you know, telling all the reasons why he's not on the family trip. I don't do that. I can honestly say I will never go back to that. I've had opportunity to, and, you know, thankfully have passed. But I won't go back to that either, because I love what freedom I have to live now without needing to overfunction and show up and be codependent on someone else.
You know, that brings me back to when you first reached out to me on Instagram. You were more concerned with me helping Brian
100%
than you were getting help yourself. At what point, Suzy, did you realize that you were probably just as sick as Brian, or even more sick, because here you were reaching out for a person that you already believed had already made all the choices for himself, and you were still trying to line him up with people who could help him, and all the while you were dying a certain death yourself.
Yeah, I can tell you, I went, you know, with the day, I will never forget the date, but yes, the day that the unmanageability of my life and the alternate life that was being lived was revealed to me in a way where I could no longer pull up my cozy blanket of denial. I called all these therapists, and the only one that called me back immediately was Scott. And my very first meeting with him, who ironically at the time he was like 24 years continuously sober, now it's like 30 something.
That's
you know, he's climbing up there. Yeah, but you'll always be in it there.
Some say don't drink or die.
Yes, exactly. And the first thing he asked me is, you know, had I heard of Al-Anon, and he recommended before our next session, which was only in a few days, that I find an Al-Anon meeting. And you know, I'm a good student. I knew how to be a really good student, and at this point I was like, I'll do whatever to get better. And so I went to my first Al-Anon meeting, and that's what I got on Instagram and literally typed in recovery. And of course, you're the recovery guy. You came up. I started following all these accounts of people that have been long time sober, some of which I still am friends with, you know, and communicate with. And when I saw how long you'd been sober at the time, it might have been like
30 years.
Or 28, 29. I remember you were turning 30. And I was like, well, this, you know, I want to see what
We've known each other longer than 8 years, and that's crazy.
Yeah, I was like, I want to see what active recovery looks like. And as soon as I started following that and going to meetings, you know, at first I just sat and listened. And then I started listening to all those YouTube speakers. And I was like, these people are crazy. Why are they laughing? They're like choking each other and drowning each other. I was like, oh my word, I thought my life was crazy. And somehow there was just enough similarity in all those stories. Like, in other words, none of them were exactly like my story, but there was just enough in all of that I could no longer say,
you knew that they knew.
Yes. Yeah. I knew that if barring a miracle of God and the miracle of me finding those rooms in recovery and doing the work, I was going to end up like that. And that was that with 3 young children. Absolutely not. That was not going to be the end of my story. And so it was very early on that through the work of, you know, having a therapist who is a recovered addict with many years of active recovery, you know, still going to meetings, you know, like you speaking out at the meetings when he, you know, saw BS. And that's just the way he was. You know, you know, I'd say something like, oh, you know, he goes, allegedly. You know, he would just immediately like remind me. Yes. And then I'll never forget my favorite thing. It was maybe the 3rd visit. He said, Suzy, you know how to tell if an addict's lying? And I leaned in.
Because their lips are moving.
Yes, that's exactly what I said. Because I was like, here's the cheat code. I'll know when he's telling the truth. If their lips are moving, I thought, oh. So all these things over the course of a very short period of time. I mean, I know that it was within the first month that it was literally easy for me to go into step 1 and say, I am powerless. And I realized, you know, immediately then I looked at my life and I looked at these stories I listened to, and I thought, it ends in death, institutions, or recovery for you and for me.
You know what? You know, one of the things that I've always appreciated about our relationship is I joke about it, but I'm very serious. There's a bit of Al-Anon in every alcoholic, and we talked about this at lunch. And honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness is the foundation of recovery from an addict, from an alcoholic standpoint. If I'm not honest about my condition, I'll never get well. You know, in the Bible, it's the book of Genesis is the book of the beginnings. If you don't start out with the truth, Ken Ham says this, if you don't start out with the truth, every other word out of your mouth is a lie.
So good.
And so true. And the same thing, if I'm not willing to admit I'm powerless over alcohol, that my life has become unmanageable. Not hyphen that. You know, that my life has become unmanageable. I'm never going to get well. So I needed to understand and fully be convinced that alcoholism, not alcohol, but alcoholism was the problem. And I had to stop drinking and make a commitment to not drinking before I would understand the insanity, the unmanageability of my life, which was the opening of the door to willingness, which entered into a power greater than myself that could allow me to usher in steps 4 through 9, which allow for my wellness to do steps 10, 11, and 12, which is a continuation. Follow that path with me. How is it for a person in Al-Anon? Defenses, myths, unbelief, false belief, all those things have to come into that first step of
true.
Step 1.
The honesty is it. That's the radical acceptance and honesty with yourself. And Robert, sadly, I think that is where most people turn around and leave the program, or just can't go because they can't be honest with themselves.
Let me interrupt you here because alcohol is, I have to get sober against an object. In Al-Anon, though, you have to get an idea, an emotion.
Yes,
you know,
because you're still, or at least even if you were to, you know, kick them out of the house or go live on an island to start working out, it's still this it's not a substance. It's this way that either you've been that you've either been raised into, like you were. You grew up in addiction. I did not, but I was certainly raised to be a codependent. There's no doubt in my family dynamic.
Talk about that just for a second. Let's take a rabbit trail.
Yeah. So, ironically, through the course of my journey with Al-Anon, I have come to believe that it's possible that I had a grandfather that was a sober alcoholic, you know, probably most of his adult life. I mean, as I got into the recovery program, I realized that my grandfather had serenity prayer in all his homes.
Yeah.
That we
probably
found.
Connection.
Oddly enough. And I looked at that irritable, restless,
discontent,
yes, that were there underlying sometimes when it wasn't his best thing. So I think there's a possibility that some of that, even though there was not alcohol, Robert, at a single family function on my mom's side of the family or my dad's side of the family a single time growing up. It didn't exist.
Yeah.
At a wedding, at a funeral, at a party, at anything. It was the teetotaler family. So to think that I would marry an alcoholic is strange. Now that I know more about codependency and I look at my family of origin, I was raised to believe it's Jesus first, others second, yourself last. Not the model of love your neighbor as yourself,
right,
which implies
love your neighbor
self-love.
Before yourself.
Yes. Or the model that Jesus, you know, walked out for, you know, retreating and you know, taking time for himself and spending time with God. You know, I wasn't raised with any of that. So I was raised, you pour yourself out for others, you know, and so you know, we talk about any strength, you know, weaknesses and overwrought work, you know, strength for you and overwrought strength. And I think, you know, there was just no doubt that I was raised for this thing where you know, you didn't speak up for yourself. If something was uncomfortable, you just kind of, you know, push that away, and that your function in life was to show up for others.
Yes. And
that is a scary combination put in conjunction with a madness of, you know, just falling madly in love with someone who had a, you know, generational issue with alcohol.
You know, you bring up something really interesting, and this is the Al-Anon side of me. I wanted to please people so badly, and I knew I wasn't capable of doing that, and that caused a great amount of pain in me, and my choice to medicate was alcohol, was drugs. And that became the pacifier. We talked about that earlier. That became the pacifier for me, that told me that I was incapable of meeting the needs of other people. Thank God I had an outlet such as alcohol. I didn't know I would have the phenomenon of craving that. Once I started drinking, I no longer had the ability to stop.
Yeah.
But it started with wanting to be everything to everyone at every moment possible. Then when I couldn't accomplish that, I it caused me a great amount of pain.
Yeah.
Where does an Al-Anon go without being an addicted?
Yeah, that same thing, that desire to show up for others perfectly all the time. You know, we talked about this. Brene Brown says that, you know, wherever perfection is driving, shame rides shotgun. And so that same,
I love that phrase.
It's so good, and it's so true. It's wherever I am trying to be everything to all people, the perfect mom, the perfect dentist, the perfect wife, the perfect, you know, that's an impossible standard. I can't even live up to my own standard for that. Yeah. So immediately then you're like filled with shame. So you just got to do better. You've got to do more. There's more you can do for people.
You know what? I love your phraseology there of ownership, your own standard. Whether or not people put that standard on you, you felt you became the personal owner of that. You didn't reject that. You received that. You accepted that. Yeah. And that's at the core of every Al-Anon.
Yes.
You take on this persona that you feel you inherited. You make it your own.
Yes, very much so. And that becomes so much a part of the gestalt with which you do life, that when you are faced with the program of Al-Anon, or whatever your bottom is that got you to those rooms, you know, whether it's your husband's sponsor said your wife needs to go, whether it's court-ordered, you know, recovery, whether it's, you know, his third DUI, and you're like, well, I better go in here with all the other people that are, you know, loving their addicts, you know, whatever it is that gets you there, you will never get better without at least starting with honesty. And so if I couldn't look at myself and be humble enough to say, I am living this life because I choose these things. My life is the sum total of the choices I've made up until this point. The behaviors I've allowed, no one had me at gunpoint. You know, I wasn't the victim of physical abuse or anything, and I didn't even have the situation that some women do where they don't even have the ability to provide for themselves to get out. None of that was true for me. I was 100% there of my own free will. And all the time, again, this idea of, you know, I'm going to keep this covenant I made with God and man, you know, well, you know, that's a whole nother discussion, what the parameters of a covenant are, but that was broken, you know, long time ago. I was still the only one holding that up and thought that was important and necessary. So without being honest, I could never get better. I would have backed out. It's
really interesting because a lot of times in the rooms I meet women primarily, Al-Anons, or women who are held hostage. And a lot of times women are held hostage because of finances.
Yes.
And everyone needs to understand that Suzy is a medical professional who's perfectly capable of taking care of all of her financial needs just by herself. She doesn't need a man to fulfill that financial need. She can own her own home. She can buy anything she wants. She can afford everything for herself and for her kids. So she wasn't even held hostage there, which almost, you know, it makes it a way for more denial with an Al-Anon than it does an alcoholic, because we have an obvious, you know, we talked about coercion during lunch. You know, it's more than likely I'm going to get fired because I show up drunk at inappropriate times or say the wrong things. Where a codependent doesn't face with that.
No.
Or I'm not going to lose my house because I've gambled away a paycheck. And Al-Anon doesn't. So a lot of the same things that drive me to the rooms, the judge isn't likely to say, you're too nice, you're too forgiving, you're too codependent, therefore we're going to put you in jail for 5 years. You know, or you don't get your third DUI because you love way too much inappropriately at the wrong times, the wrong person. So in one way, there's a similarity what drives us to the rooms. In like of an alcoholic, they're more obvious. There's more coercion involved. You know, we're going to get you to the rooms because you're too nice. You're too codependent. You're too this. You're too forgiving. What? Did you understand the question?
No, I do understand. I think it's, you know, it's those same things. Like we talked about this a little bit earlier too. Laura and I did. The very things that are rewarded in the workplace are the things that codependents do in relationship that's devastating to their own well-being and certainly to the family dynamic. So you'll be rewarded all day long for over-functioning at work, showing up and taking care of everything, whether you want to call it people pleasing taken to an extreme, controlism, being a control freak. I call myself a recovered, like you introduced yourself as a recovered alcoholic. I'm a recovered people pleaser and recovered perfectionist, control freak. I mean, absolutely. Because I can say that I am recovered from that, because there's no part of me now that wants to show up in those ways. Yeah. My kids are in trouble, because if they do ever struggle with substances, like we talked about, I already know I'm not going to stand in the in between their consequences and their higher power. So I think the reason it's, like you say, it's more hidden, it's actually rewarded. Those behaviors are so rewarded publicly that they're hard to let go of.
She's so understanding. He's so thoughtful.
Oh,
he's
it'll
so
get
caring.
done. Susie's on the committee. You don't have to worry about it. She'll get it taken care of. She'll, we were I mean, don't you think I'm the same mom that was throwing all the dances and making sure there was a prom when COVID hit and all, it's like, it's those
you get rewarded for things. Well, if Robert shows up and he's too drunk, I don't get a badge. I don't. You were the drunkest person here. Congratulations. Here's your
You're the most
trophy.
Functioning human there is. Look at that. And now the fact that I can look and value rest. Value no as a complete sentence. Value telling somebody I'm sorry.
No is a complete sentence.
Yes. I can value telling somebody I'm sorry, I don't have the capacity for that this week. I don't have the bandwidth for this conversation right now, because I know what it takes for me to live happy, joyous, and free, and what it takes to honor who I am, my relationship that I've developed with myself through this program. I will not violate that the same way you wouldn't violate your marriage vows. There are rules that I live by and continue to grow in that say this is not okay for me. So like, we talked about, I had the opportunity to explore a relationship with someone that I found out was really way too newly sober for it to be okay. And while I told him, I hope I know you in 5 years and this was the first 60 days of the rest of your life. I hope it is. I'm just not going to be your partner while you figure that out. Because I know that is not good for my well-being. I don't even want the opportunity to practice, going down that road again. But I do think I would feel differently with somebody that's had many years of sobriety, because if anything, they're less likely to have a problem with than anyone, because they've already looked at that animal, they've faced that. There's a lot of beautiful things about people in long-term recovery. I just know from you, actually very specifically, and from many other people that have had a long-term recovery, they all talk about that first 5 years, and that you almost have to be selfish about your own recovery. And the same was true for me in my recovery. That was not a time for me to enter into partnership with anyone, because I needed to work those things out in myself so that I knew that I was well enough to show up emotionally, spiritually, financially, relationally for another human being whole, and not needing them to fill something for me.
Yeah. It's wonderful. I love our conversations, because we're on opposite sides of the table, but we sit in the middle together. And I remember when I moved back from California, from Las Vegas to California, early on in sobriety, within 2 years, to me that's early. I stopped getting 30, 60, 90-day chips, and I stopped raising my hand as a newcomer, but in my mind, I'm always new. To this day, I'm always new, because I'm always... Winston Churchill, who was the Chancellor of Great Britain in 1952, said, everyone wants to learn, but no one wants to be taught. What a great quote that is, and that applies to me. I don't want to be taught. I want to tell you I don't know. I already know. You can't tell me anything. Where I get some of the greatest insight from newcomers who have a new, fresh approach to the same thing I've been studying for over 38 years. But anyway, I thought I was sober. I was ready for relationships. And so after another failed relationship, it was a litany of failed relationships early in sobriety, and just a carryover. But I was sober now, so I thought I was well. And I went and I had another failed relationship, and I had a conversation with a guy named Bill, who kind of was my temporary sponsor in Fullerton when I moved back to Southern California. And I went and I wanted to put the onus on someone else. What was her problem? I'm sober. I'm this, I'm that, and the other. And he said, You don't have relationships. You take hostages.
Yeah.
And I said, how dare you?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I'm sober. I'm the sober
Yeah.
equation in this. And the other person was sober as well. He said, but you haven't changed. You still need, and this is the Al-Anon me, you still need someone to tell you you're okay. And until you believe you're okay just because you're okay, there is no one out there outside of you who can do the inside job that needs to be done. That's between God and you. And until you come into agreement with that, you're always going to need someone to validate you. So stop taking hostages and stop being willing to be a hostage in order to make this thing work. And I thought, well, you're the last. I'm never talking to you again.
How offending.
Because I thought I was just, and I was a wonderful person, but I still needed someone else to validate. You know, and it leads me to something we talked about when we talked about putting this conversation together. I find, for different reasons, and for the same reason, people in the rooms of AA, they come in for 1 or 2 years, and then they face a jumping off place, as it says in the big book. They can't imagine their life with alcohol, and they can't imagine their life with it. They're at a jumping off place. And I tell people all the time, this is not let's make a deal. There is no door number 3. And for that, I'm so grateful I got clean and sober in Las Vegas, because there was no door number 3. There was no middle of the road. Either you were going to die drunk or you got well. There was no, and they told me in the rooms, you either stay, you either learn this, or you go get drunk, because there's no other option for people like you and me. You either stay or you go. And isn't that, and yet we think we can stay in the rooms. We think we can be a person who's going to figure out this thing half measuring. And we can't. There is no substitute for wellness, none whatsoever. And I find people, going back to that honesty is a part of my entire recovery. I still need to be honest with me, with God, to Laura, to every relationship I have in my life, because when I cease being honest, I become, everyone wants to learn, but no one wants to be taught. I had a pastor, my spiritual advisor, years ago, and he would usually do this as we were golfing, and he would usually do that at the turn between hole 9 and 10, because he knows I'm not going to turn back at this point, no matter how bad I'm golfing. And he would come up to me, put his arm around me, and say, "Are you teachable?" And I thought, crap. Now he's going to tell me some principles, something he's noticed about my life, and I want to tell him no. But as painful as it was, I told him, of course I'm teachable. Of course you can share with me what you've seen in my life. And he would tell me of a principle, something I needed to understand, something he observed, and I needed to stay teachable. And you know, I think certainly, if not why I'm sober for 38 plus years, but I can tell you it's because it's why I'm happy, joyous, and free.
So good. That idea.
What is the stumbling block you find in Al-Anon? You've been there 8-9 years now. What do you think is a stumbling block between people who say they want what you have, but aren't willing to get it?
Well, Robert, it's the same as your room. So you and I talked about at lunch that there's people that are refraining from drinking alcohol, so they are technically sober, but they're not recovered. They're two different things. There are women in my group, people in my group that have been in those rooms 30 years and are still not living happy, joyous, and free. You know, they're here because, by golly, you know, it's the right thing to do. I'll be here, but they're still, living very similarly. So the equivalent, the Al-Anon equivalent of a dry drunk, And I think as critical as honesty is, the other H that is equally important is that humility. So the way to be teachable is to be humble. All of us want the shortcut. Sure, I'd love to have gone into Al-Anon, downloaded some files into my brain, walked out a perfectly whole human.
You mean you can't?
No, apparently not. Apparently I've got to do the work, which I'm grateful for, and God is kind enough to let that work happen over a period of time as I'm able to absorb it and practice it, and then the next teachable moment. So I think honesty and humility go hand in hand, because they are paramount to that transparency. They're paramount to accountability. That's the honesty part. But then the service work and the gratitude are all linked up with that teachability. And those things are present in every long-term recovered person I know, from my side of the road and from your side of the the table. Whether you're an addict or whether you're recovering from codependency, they both require that just radical honesty with yourself about a situation and about your relationships. And what that meant, Robert, honestly, there are people that do not have the same place in my life now. And it's not because they were an alcoholic. It's because their relationship with me was bound up to that need for me to overfunction or fulfill some sort of role for them. And when I ceased doing that, I was no longer useful to them. And I have to be okay with that. I choose this wellness and this mental and emotional sobriety all day long over those people that dropped away from my life. Some of them, it was a choice on my part when it became painfully obvious that they wanted me not well. They needed me to be who I was before, where I'd say yes to everything. Whatever you need, here I am. No. And so I think that humility that allows you, the honesty to get real with yourself about what has to be removed from my life for me to look different, and what do I need to add to my life, and then that humility to be teachable, because I will be constantly presented, and have been over the course of the last 8 years, whether it's in an exchange with my children or the loss of their father through permanent, through death. I mean, talk about testing my emotional sobriety and my recovery. I mean, that was harder than the marriage ending for me, for many layers, because it involved a grief for my children that wasn't something there was a quick fix for either. So my ability to sit honestly with their grief and hold space for that, and then the humility I needed to have to not try to make it better or to try to remind them of all the ways, when they were glossing over some of their memories. That's okay with me. I don't need them to remember all the minutia of how things weren't great. That doesn't matter. It's really not. That I have the humility to allow whatever they needed to grieve and walk through that, and whatever they needed to remember about him, so that they could heal and they could grieve. I don't want them to be stuck in this cycle of, now I need a substance to push down and escape from my life. Because when we talk about lunch, you cannot selectively numb. If you numb the pain, you also numb the joy. And I didn't want my kids living joyless. I don't want to live joyless.
No, and I think, we become happy, joyous, and free. And I remember the first time my sponsor, Will, has been sober 44 years, as you know.
So cool.
And I knew Will. The first time I ever met Will, he said, "I'm a happy, grateful, recovered alcoholic." And I took offense to that. I thought, who is this arrogant guy? And it's obvious that it's obvious now, but he said, I went up to him after the meeting and I challenged his arrogancy. And he said, if you have time, sit down with me and I'll show you in the first 164 pages where I can be happy, I can be joyous, and I can be free. And if you're not, stick around, and one of the things that, and so I became a student of the Big Book in that moment, and they told me early on, because no one likes to admit that they're sick, right? No one. I always wanted to be somebody else. I wanted to be the wife. I wanted to be the boss.
Terminal uniqueness too. I'm not like them.
They call it terminal uniqueness for a reason.
Yes.
Terminal, it's going to kill me. And you're a medical professional. If somebody has a terminal condition, they're as good as dead. It's just a matter, not if they're going to die from that condition, but when are they going to die? But it's going to surely kill us. And they told me early on that if you're not sure you're an alcoholic, stick around because you'll do till one shows up, which I think is hilarious. You're going to do just fine. Stick around.
I love that.
And the same way, but if you're not sure if you're an Al-Anon, people who are well don't usually end up in the rooms of Al-Anon any more than a person who's on a sabbatical and things are going great. They usually don't end up in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. And we come at it from different sides, but we're still, there's a compulsion about us. My compulsion to drink and make it necessary for me to drink is the same compulsion that makes you want to fix another person, because while I'm drinking, I'm not looking at me.
That's exactly what it is. If I'm focused on somebody else's thing that I can show up and do, I don't have to look at myself. And that's where the work was. That's why I wasn't getting any better.
Yeah. And so do you find that? I find a stumbling block at a certain point. An alcoholic almost needs to stop looking because they're afraid of what they'll find. Nietzsche said, when you stare into the abyss, it stares back. Mm-hmm. At what point, and I know in the life, in many cases, we stop looking because I don't want, everybody does step 1, 2, and 3, or so they say, surrender, and then they really don't want to do step 4. And if they don't want to do step 4, they're not going to do step 5 because that's the admitting.
Right.
And if you're not willing to do step 5, you're not ready to have God, you're not entirely ready to have God remove the defects, and you're not going to be humble to ask Him to remove the shortcomings in step 7. And I love what Joe and Charlie talk about in steps 8 and 9 in the amends steps. They say right now, later, maybe, and never.
I like that.
In terms of the
amends.
In terms of the amends. And as long as it's your fault, I don't have to make it mine. And as soon as you admit your fault to me, I'll admit my fault to you. That's not taking ownership.
No.
And just like alcoholism recovery, I need to take ownership of my condition. It was never about my wife. It was never about the job. If that's the case, why can't I have a good relationship not drinking?
Yeah.
If alcohol was the problem, why am I still upside down and I'm not drinking?
Yeah.
The insanity that how I would live out my life is what needs to be addressed. Alcohol, not drinking is just the beginning of my journey. It's not my journey. No. I'm a chronic alcoholic. I'm not an acute alcoholic. I can't stop drinking it and expect to get well. And so it is a journey for Al-Anons as well as it is.
Absolutely.
Is there any point where you can ever get completely well where you don't have to go back?
I mean, that's a good question, Robert. I think, like you said, if you never went to another meeting again, you'd probably never go back to alcohol, but why would you, quit going? I don't see a point at which I will ever live, directly with addiction again, just because of choices that I will, make moving forward should I ever partner again. Can I predict whether my children would ever struggle with that? I don't know. But the principles of this program, I will walk out as long as I have breath because it's a path to wellness. So whether or not I ever live with active addiction again is the same reason it couldn't be the answer to why I started getting better. Mm-hmm. It can't be the answer to whether or not I think that this program is worth living by for the rest of my life. So the principles of this program, the steps, especially the ownership and the radical acceptance. It's helped me walk through my son's heart disease, through their father's death. If I can practice radical acceptance of things as they are right now and not, I wish, if only, that's ridiculous. I'm not going to live the rest of my life wasting my energy on all of that. This is exactly the reality of right now. So if I stop using denial even in situations that have nothing to do with alcohol, it's a better way to live.
Yeah.
And then I can practice all those principles. That's where, to me, outside of the steps, our next layer, I love those. They mean a lot to me, and I think they work in the workplace. They work, we talked about this the last time. But I don't, in other words, is there a belief that I'm a recovered people pleaser, a recovered, perfectionist or overachiever for others? Yes, I believe I'm recovered of that. But does that mean that I'm going to suddenly forgo the principles that got me better? No.
And I like that because just because we're recovered, and this is why I try to make the distinction in the rooms, I stay recovered because I stay in recovery.
Yeah.
So I have a permanent position because I stay in an active pursuit.
Yeah. And it's the reason I would say yes anytime you reach out to me with somebody. What is the success rate of other people, saying, I want some of that, and what does it look like? How do I get better? am I successful every time that I, share the program of Al-Anon with someone? No, but does it mean that I'll ever just go, you know what, I'm not even going to worry with that anymore? Absolutely not, because I remember what it feels like to not be able to breathe.
Yeah, and I like that because breathing is sharing the message of wholeness, and you can identify, that person in your professional workplace, in your personal workspace. You can, if anything, in a very unique way, Al-Anons are much more savvy than most alcoholics. We think that once we stop drinking, then that I love the example in the big book where they give the illustration of the farmer, and he and his wife are down in the storm cellar, and a tornado comes through, and he comes out, and she's looking at all the devastation. She's looking at the ranch all tore up, and he thinks it's wonderful that the wind stopped blowing. We just look at it, I'm not drinking, what else do you want from me?
Yeah.
And you're looking at a destroyed relationship, a destroyed home. And in some ways, an Al-Anon has more to clean up than most alcoholics, because I think most people they think that alcohol was the problem. And it's alcoholism, it's a selflessness and self-centeredness. That's my problem. Alcohol is just a form of medication. It could have been a gallon of Haagen-Dazs. It could have been anything, but I chose alcohol, and alcohol had chosen me a long time ago, so that's that phenomena of craving. So what is your journey like? I know there's a parallel between the steps. One of the reasons that I never want to leave recovery of the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous is because this thing called Step 12, where I acknowledge my spiritual awakening, I help the other alcoholic to achieve sobriety, and then I practice the principles in all my affairs. I don't know how I could do the second and third portion of that step, of Step 12, without being in the room, because that's the greatest concentration.
Yes.
You want to find an alcoholic? Go find somebody trying to get sober. Do you find the same?
Yeah, maybe it's because you said that about the study. I think as ubiquitous or pervasive as alcoholism is, I think codependency might even be more so.
Yeah.
So just like you can probably spot a drunk that's trying to make everyone believe they're sober quicker than anyone. You can call BS on, all of those shenanigans when you're like, you are not sober. And it's the same thing. I think I have a radar for people that are over functioning, showing up for, making excuses for someone else's behavior, all those kind of things. So interestingly, in my own life, I run into those people all kinds of places outside the room of Al-Anon. Yeah. But if you go to an Al-Anon, you're certainly going to find somebody that is in need of your experience, strength, and hope. I mean, were it not for those, I wouldn't have found my sponsor. I wouldn't have found a community of shared common experience, that was a safe place for me to go, oh, me too, And so, and that last part of it, to practice those principles in all my affairs, that is a life's work. That's a life's work. Like that.
I like that me too. It's overused. But Me Too, looking for the similarities is so important because we often want to look for differences.
We are that terminal uniqueness that exists in our rooms. Everybody, well, you don't understand. He's this. One of them. He's
really nice.
He's a practicing judge. So to admit that you're in this relationship with this, that's scary. It's like all the we have every excuse in the world why our situation is different. And I made a promise to God, and He's really. If you knew Him, everyone loves Him. Life of the party, all that stuff. Yeah, it's the very same. The very same thing in our sides of the room.
In a lot of respects, I was very grateful to admit that I was alcoholic. On page 30 of the big book, it says we had to admit to our innermost self that we were alcoholic. This is the first step in recovery. And then step one is we admitted we are powerless over alcohol, that our life had become unmanageable. It was, as much as I didn't want to be an alcoholic, I'm grateful that I found out I was. A lot of times in the rooms, I'm so-and-so, I'm a grateful alcoholic. I'm not a grateful alcoholic. I'm a grateful recovered alcoholic.
Yes.
That's what I'm grateful for, because in recovery I'm healing. While I was just an alcoholic, I was hurting, I was damaging good marriages with good women, and damaging daughters, and damaging I'm never grateful for that alcoholic condition. I'm grateful that I discovered I'm an alcoholic and that I have a treatable condition. And the challenge was it demanded rigorous honesty, but once I was able to get past that, I'm grateful I'm a recovered alcoholic. I'm grateful I'm working the steps. Do you find the same thing true in the rooms of Al-Anon? It's difficult to admit that you're codependent, but once you discover that, because I went from being a bad person trying to get better to a sick person trying to get well.
Oh, 100%.
Is that same transformation?
Yes. Being honest with yourself means there's a starting point.
Yeah.
If I kept denying how absolutely off the rails my life was and was going, I would have never had the opportunity to stop and say, help. What there is help available, and there is a path forward. I saw people that were living happy, joyous, and free that had walked through those things and worse. So yes, there is a relief in that if you're willing to be honest enough and humble enough to say, yes, and there's another path, and that's when we're in a place to take step one as well. And it's hard to imagine. We were talking about this at lunch. I can't imagine what my life would look like, but the beauty of stringing those days together. Yes, we're not grateful for that. I'm not a grateful Al-Anon. I'm a grateful recovered Al-Anon. Yeah. Same as you. And now you have 10 grandchildren and beautiful relationships in your life that are a gift of recovery.
Yeah.
I have 3 children that are teens and young adults that choose to spend time with me, that schedule time in their schedule. I was not the mom that they probably would have thought. They were probably at a point where they thought, oh, I can't wait to not have to be around this, maybe. I don't know. I've never said that, but I know where I was headed and how, absolutely not making sense. And I'm sure there was just a lot of chaos and that walking on eggshells where I was always trying to, appease their dad. They were trying to appease their dad, and then by that appease me. And now I look at these beautiful relationships with these kids and the way they treat each other, the way they treat others, the way that they want to spend time. That is a gift of recovery for me. And the fact that I didn't immediately go and re-partner and repeat that cycle that you and I have both seen in our rooms of, okay, if you're going to say it's their fault, you're going to get out of that relationship, not work on yourself, and be right back in another hostage situation.
We've seen
it. It's literally a hostage exchange. Yeah. And I look at that and think how grateful I am. That's the gift of this recovery for me, is that I am no longer involved in that. And I shared that article from Laura McCowan about, she went from, she'll never drink again. She's free from the alcoholism, but then it just transformed into this need to fill that with love, and it became love addiction. And now she's living free from all of that and saying, wow, to take life on with no vices. Now, who would have thought love was a vice, but that's not love. I mean, you and I both know that's not love. That's not the true definition, but that addiction to the need to have your feel good, as you always say, or to be in a relationship where you're being somehow validated by another human being, to live free of that. Now that is where the work really is. Yeah.
So what would be, as we close out here today, what would be some of the identifiers? Because, like I say, there's a bit of Al-Anon in every alcoholic. What would you say would be some identifiers, the men and women you meet in the rooms, and identifiers you found in yourself? Because at the end of the day, we all need to take our own inventory. And you can't call someone an Al-Anon any more than I can label someone an alcoholic, because we can, but what's it going to do? Until we admit to our innermost self, there's very little hope of our recovery. So what are some of the awarenesses that you gained early on and that you revisit now that would help us take our inventory to say, who am I? What am I doing? Where do I identify? Am I drinking because I'm alcoholic, or am I drinking because of this relationship? And where do I fit?
Yeah, I would say in other words, if you look at the keys to sobriety and my emotional sobriety are honesty and humility. So let's start with 2 indicators would be a lack of teachability, a lack of humility, and a lack of honesty. Those 2 things, let's start with those. If you tend to not be able to be honest with yourself and others, and you tend to just not believe anyone has anything to teach you, and you're never wrong, and you can't apologize. So those are 2 things that probably put you at risk for partnering with someone that you're going to now enter a codependent relationship. I'd start with that. If you're a person that has difficulty just saying no, you might be likely to enter into one of those relationships. If you're someone that shows up and makes excuses for everyone else instead of letting them accept the consequence of their own choices and actions, if my kids don't do their laundry, there is not a magical laundry fairy in my house. So if they want to put on dirty underwear and live in that can happen, but I'm not going to go do their laundry. When they were young, of course I did their laundry. It wasn't a matter of me over functioning. They were children, but none of them are at an age where they, so if I do for others what they could and should do for themselves, that should be a little indicator light on my dashboard.
Wow.
So whether you do that in the workplace or in a home or in a relationship, I would suggest that's an indicator that you're at risk for overfunctioning in a relationship.
To own what?
If you are doing for others what they could and should do for themselves, for sure.
Yeah, and like I had that person contact me last night who got upset with me because he accused me of not having time for him, and I said, well, the time to call me was before you drank, not after you drank. Yes. And I'm not the enemy. The enemy is your alcoholism. It's not me.
Right.
And some people will call that harsh and uncaring. I call it realistic because I'm not his problem.
No, and I call it healthy because it means you are not going to automatically put yourself in a position to be his hostage.
Exactly.
That's called healthy.
Yeah, and until he owns his own alcoholism, I can't do anything for him.
Cannot.
And you can't.
I can't care more about your wellness than you care about it yourself.
I love that.
Yeah.
Say that again.
I cannot care about your wellness more than you do.
Wow. And I love that because it makes your recovery the same as mine, which is inside out.
Yeah.
I need you to own what you need to own because I'm going to own what I need to own, and between the 2 we get well at the same time.
Yes, and I think a boundary for a relationship, if you take an alcoholic and an Al-Anon and you put them together and they're both well or getting well and they're both headed in the same direction, then it looks like I am here for you. I'm willing to help you. But the minute it looks like I'm helping you more than you're helping yourself, I'm done.
Yeah. My sponsor, Will, says at the end of the day we can't do anyone's 4-step for them. They need to take ownership, take responsibility for their own recovery. You have to become responsible, as Stephen Covey would say, responsible to do this yourself. I'll be there to help you and support you along the way, but you need to take ownership of your recovery. You need to take ownership of your wellness, because until we do, our wellness comes from outside of us, not inside of us. And people either through omission or commission, they leave. Yeah. They don't all leave for the same reasons. Wow. They're not responsible. Some leave because of death. Some leave for a number of different reasons. But if my wellness is tied to a person, place, or thing, or a substance, I'll never get well.
Exactly.
Because my wellness depends upon that person being in my life.
Yes.
And that person being in my life is a benefit of my sobriety. They are not my sobriety. The sobriety, you being sober of sound thinking is as important to an Al-Anon as it is
100%,
to an alcoholic.
And it cannot be connected to whether or not they relapse.
Yes.
It just can't be.
And relapse happens in Al-Anon
100%.
as well as you relapse in a different way, but a relapse is a relapse.
I absolutely remember one of mine. It was probably 6 months in to my divorce, and I allowed an engagement, an emotional engagement. I allowed myself to be taken hostage to I fully engaged in this conversation that ended up with me raising my voice on the back porch. My kids all heard it. They knew exactly who I was talking to. This was early in the divorce. And I had never let myself, I was so proud of the things that I had been working through, and I didn't have to respond to everything. No is a complete sentence, all those things. And then I relapsed. I emotionally relapsed, re-engaged in one of these conversations, emotionally invested in a conversation he didn't even remember the next day. And I remember talking to my therapist the next time I went, because I had a therapy session before my next Al-Anon meeting, and he goes, "How did that go for you?" And I said, "It was terrible. It was awful." He goes, "So you have an opportunity to do it different next time, don't you?" And I was like, yeah, I do. And I immediately, at my next meeting, and talked to my sponsor about it, because it was just, and the profound I'm not recommending relapse, but you had one early on. This was my early on relapse. And I can promise you, I disliked the feeling of that so much, because I had just enough taste of emotional wellness that I knew I would never do it again. And I didn't. I will say that was my big relapse, and I had just enough taste of what it looked like to live without that I knew the cost was too high. I wasn't willing to pay the price.
There is such a parallel between your Al-Anon relapse and my relapse. As many in the audience know, I relapsed after 71 days. And I remember sitting in the hotel room trying to recapture that feeling of I was never going to be somebody, but I was trying to, and I could not recapture it. And I had been in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous long enough to know that these people, they understood a person like me. They understood everything I wanted to be, and they understood everything that it took for me to get there. And it was within that understanding that I thought the only chance I have is to go back to the rooms. If I'm ever going to get well, if I'm ever going to recover, it needed to be in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. And 38 plus years later, I've never left, because I've never found a substitute for that. I've never found anything that makes me feel better about me and gives me purpose and confidence. And again, it's not I don't go because I need it. I go because I want it, and I never want to lose this feeling. And it makes no sense to me to go anywhere else. It's like Dorothy in the end of The Wizard of Oz. If I ever want to find happiness, I never look any further than my own backyard. And the rooms of recovery is my own backyard.
I love that. It's funny, the irony that we would both be in situations that were not free at all. You think drinking gives you freedom, like I can do whatever I want, I can whatever. You've never lived more free than you're living right now.
The freedom I have
is incredible.
It's unbelievable.
In every way. It's all the ways you weren't free when you found those rooms. You are financially free. You are emotionally free. You are spiritually free. You are relationally free. And it's evident all around you in your relationship with your wife and your kids and your grandkids, and the ability to travel. Yes, and it's beautiful. So thank you for being the longest continuously sober person I personally know, and inspiring still. We're better together.
I appreciate that. And just so you know, if you ever wanted to explore the rooms of Al-Anon, you can reach Suzy through me. And then also, if you go to my website, Recovery, this is my shameless plug, and I feel no shame, recoveryguy.org, you can go to my blogs, and Suzy has written a number. It's called Suzy Says, and she's written on the 12 steps of Al-Anon. She's done a number of articles for us. And she is such a dear friend, and my recovery is better because I know Suzy. And
likewise.
And so, if you want to explore that, because again, I believe that within every Al-Anon, if you were ever a hostage taker, you're probably eligible to the rooms of Al-Anon. And the times that I accidentally and on purpose ended up in a room of Al-Anon, I can relate to them as well, because I needed people to make me feel better about who I was, and that is, if that doesn't qualify me for the rooms of Al-Anon, then nothing will. Suzy, any parting thoughts before we sign off for the day?
No, just that I would encourage you, if any of those things that we talked about sound like you at the end when Robert said, what are some of those indicators, just have the courage to be honest with yourself. It's the bravest thing you'll ever do, is to just be honest with yourself, because you don't have to live on the edge of someone else's emotional razor. You just don't. You don't. And there is another way, and it doesn't always mean the dissolution of a relationship. In some cases where you're both trying to get better, I can't think of anything better. I personally know some couples that are both recovered from their individual programs that are living beautiful lives together now. Because of this program, I think they're both better for life, and their relationship will probably be stronger than anybody that's never been in either room.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for taking the time. I'm always excited to come back to Florida because it means we get to spend time with Suzy. And I hope you've enjoyed this podcast as much as we've enjoyed putting it together. We had talked last week about what we were going to talk about, and so this is just very exciting for me to have you on. So go to Recovery Guy Podcast to get this. If you found us through our website, recoveryguy.org, or certainly on YouTube, Real Recovery Guy. And on Instagram, you can find me at recovery_guy. And we certainly look forward to seeing you and hearing from you. As I often say, we got broken apart, but we get whole together. My name is Robert. I'm the Recovery Guy, and I'm with
Suzy,
the Recovery Gal. Have a great day. Thank you so much. Be blessed.